Very warm welcome this evening to our lecture. Our lecturer tonight is Edward Day, and he's a Church of England ordinand at Ripon College, Cuddesdon. This year he's been studying the Henrician Canons as part of his MST in Oxford. Actually, just completely by coincidence, I happen to be in Oxford this evening, although I'm not physically present with Edward, and thank you to Wycliffe Hall for giving me this room to run the session from. Edward is in, I think, 3 weeks' time going to be made deacon and will be serving his title parish in Bath and Wells Diocese. So, Edward, it is very good indeed to welcome you virtually to this ELS lecture, and we look forward very much to what you have to say to us. Over to you.
There we go. Just if people could quickly nod their heads if you can see the presentation. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So as Russell has said, I've been looking at the shape of ordained ministry in the Henrician Canons as part of my current ongoing masters at the University of Oxford, whilst also training for ordination myself. So what I was intending to do is to start by looking a little bit at the manuscript that contains the Henrician Canons before walking you through the life and, if I say the life, also the death of the Henrician Canons, as it were, before briefly talking about the state of scholarship and the extent to which the Henrician Canons are studied and why they may or may not be studied. I then want to really bring out the sort of context and a contextualization of the Henrician Canons to show what period they speak into and the importance. And that's really where I've come to focus the study on the Henrician Canons on ordained ministry, because I'm finding ordained ministry and the notion of holy orders versus whether or not priesthood is a holy order or an office is quite a contentious and a fun topic in the 1530s. I'll then go into the contents of the canons relating to ordained ministry. And in order to give you a bit of a flavour, I'm going to go through quite a few of the canons just so that you get a bit of it and hopefully can find that enjoyable. And then I'm going to end by talking about some of the medieval sources that make up this code of canons. And part of that is really to illustrate that the Henrician canons, I think, are fundamentally a very conservative set of canons. They're not awfully unique in a lot of ways. They build a lot on the existing corpus of medieval canon law. There we go. So to begin with the journey of the manuscript, so this is the only surviving copy of the Henrician Canons that's currently in the British Library. And I have very deliberately taken this photo on the left-hand side so that you can see the little green sign that gives me permission to take photos. So please don't worry, I have had permission to do it. And this manuscript had a rather illustrious list of owners. So it began its life in the office of Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, before moving on to John Fox. From this famous martyrologist John Fox, it moved to Robert Beale, who was clerk to the Privy Council during the reign of Elizabeth I. And after Robert Beale's death in 1661, it passed on to his daughter Margaret, who was the wife of Sir Henry Yolverton. It stayed in the Yolverton family until 1795, when it was acquired by Sir Henry Calthorpe, and remained in his family until 1953, when one of his ancestors sold it to the British Museum. It then moved from the British Museum to the British Library on its establishment in 1973, and made its final move to where it currently is in 1998, and it now is at the St Pancras site of the British Library in London. It was noted in Edward Bernard's catalogue of 1697, although it's not entirely certain whether or not he fully appreciated the significance of what he had in front of him. And the manuscript is currently bound with a couple of other documents. So some notes on conciliar decrees, 2 tracts in Latin by Pierre Alexandre, papers relating to the French Protestant Church, and some of Robert Beale's notes on St Matthew's Gospel. The fact that it's written, as you can see in the pictures, in secretary hand, it gives the potential that this copy may have indeed been intended to present to King Henry VIII. Whether or not he actually saw it, it is a little bit of a mystery, although if he did see it, one can't say that it had an awfully lasting impact on him. So despite being noted in Edward Bernard's catalogue, it's slightly gone into a bit of a decline, and nobody quite realised its significance or where it was. This is until 1974, when Donald Logan rediscovered it as it was and wrote an article on it. It was then in the year 2000, that Gerald Bray translated it, edited it, and published it, which I must say is exceptionally useful for trying to study it in your master's dissertation. So to talk a little bit about the life of the Henrician canons. So really, Henry VIII, one of the major aims, I think, that he had in terms of his sort of legal and religious reform is to try and have a comprehensive reform of canon law. And despite the fact that he's tried this, it's worth saying that Henry VIII never succeeded in having this comprehensive reform of the canon law. So we see these three statutes that I've put on. These, in essence, the enabling acts that try to do this. And these also all track, in essence, the failure of the government to achieve this whole-scale reform of canon law. In essence, as Donald Logan says, the aim was clearly, of this set of canons, was clearly to depapalize the existing law. So it's highly linked with the existing reforms of Henry and the introduction of the royal supremacy. So we see the first sort of enabling provision in 1533 in the Suppression of the Clergy Act. So as well as the king suppressing the convocations, requiring royal assent for the passing of canons, and only allowing the convocations to meet under his summons, it also included a provision to make a commission of 32 persons who would be appointed to approve a new set of canon law. What we learn, however, is that by 1535, this commission was never established and never convened, and there was no set of law that was ready to go to it. And so Parliament decided to try again and make another bit of enabling legislation that you'll see in the middle, and this was to give the king another chance to convene this commission and to reform canon law. However, again, it didn't quite happen. And so again, Parliament in 1542 had to return to the topic. And this time, as you'll see at the end, added the very nice clause to, in essence, remove any sunset clause or time barrier and allow it to happen at any point during Henry VIII's life. He, however, died in 1547 and had never called this commission. Despite the fact that the commission had never met, quite a lot of work still happened, and a draft set of canons, that is the Henrician canons, was produced. And it was produced by these four men at the top. So Richard Gwent was the chair of the committee, and he was Dean of the Arches. It's interesting to note that all four members of this drafting committee were either Welsh or John Hughes, who was from the Welsh Marches. As well as that, the more significant connection is that all four of them were members of the Doctors' Commons. And what they did in their drafting was to take a lot of the existing canon law, and to put it quite bluntly, it was a very good copy and paste job, where they're taking all of the existing law and trying to make it conform with the introduction of the royal supremacy. There is a little bit of uncertainty as to when exactly it was written and when it was finished. However, I've gone with 1535, agreeing with Logan's estimate. This is mainly based on the fact that it evidently has to be post the break with Rome, because Henry has, in the preface, is referred to as the supreme head of the Church of England. But likewise, some of the canons still contain provisions relating to monasteries, and a list of addresses would suggest that it must have been before the dissolution of the major monasteries in 1539. Further evidence to support the fact that it must have been written by 1535 can be found in the Calendar of State Papers. So Richard Gwent wrote twice to Thomas Cromwell, the first time saying that he had a report on the progress of the laws, and secondly, he wrote on the 27th of October 1535 to request a meeting with the king. One can guess that this request was in order to show this copy of the canons to King Henry. It was, however, not finished, which is a bit of a great mystery. So I've put on the bottom the final canon that I will briefly read to you. I'm just going to move my camera. There we go. So the final canon ends a little bit abruptly. So if there are many people who are suspended by the same laws, who have the same business and the same ground of offence, who have been condemned by the same sentences, and that is the end of the canons. We don't even get to the end of that sentence, and this is a canon relating to suits of nullity. Gerald Bray gave a slight suggestion of why it might have been unfinished, and that's simply that a scribe went away and took a break, and by the time he came back to finish the work, the canons were no longer needed. And this is the really important point about the Henrician canons, is that they were not enacted, they were unpromulgated, and they never became part of the statute book, as it were. And they were dismissed by Thomas Cromwell. Arguably, this is because Cromwell decided that the better way to enact religious reform would be through primary parliamentary legislation, so acts of parliament. The reason he might have wanted to do this was generally because canons could be seen as a little bit more restrictive and arguably more conservative form of legislation that he would have found difficult to keep up with the intensity of religious reform that Cromwell would have desired. Because the Henrician canons were unpromulgated, this does mean that they've been dismissed by scholars. So Torrance Kirby, for example, wrote that given the rapid pace of industrial and doctrinal transformation in the mid-1530s, it is fair to say that this first attempt at revision was obsolete before the ink was dry. And I think this is rather illustrative of what I'll call the prevailing scholarly opinion. That is that the Henrician canons, in a large amount, because they are unpromulgated, are irrelevant. And often they get brushed away as being simply an incidentally conservative set of canons. I, however, in this research, want to be breaking free from this, and I'm trying to promote some form of methodological value in studying unpromulgated legislation. And the reason I think there's methodological value and utility in studying unpromulgated legislation, it isn't to try and put it on a sort of over-the-top high horse and to say this can entirely change our perspective of the English Reformation or of whichever matter one's looking at. But it's to say that it has value for the exact reasons of where one might say it's no longer relevant. It has a clear life and therefore provides a very clear snapshot of a particular time and a particular point of thinking. And so it's trying to accept that there is value, but there is a limited value. So to try and be realistic about what one can do with it. And what I've tried to do then is to take this ability to look at a snapshot and then to look into something that's exceptionally interesting and contentious. And that's how I've come to look at the shape of ordained ministry in the Henrician canons, because in the 1530s, as I will go into, there's quite a lot of contention and potential challenge to the normative understanding of priesthood as a holy order. And so the argument that I've been making is that through a form of contextualization of the canons, their conservatism comes to life. It's no longer incidentally conservative, just taking the corpus, just drawing from the existing corpus of medieval canon law. Rather, it is deliberately adding conservative voice to an ongoing argument. So to look at some of this contextualization, it's worth saying that there's a lot of challenge that's emerged from the continental European Reformation, particularly Martin Luther, as we have on the left, and John Calvin. So the notion of priesthood gets some form of challenge in its traditional understanding through theories such as the royal priesthood and notions of universal priesthood. Also, priesthood has a form of, if one wants to call it, a sort of emphasis shift, with both Luther and Calvin promoting the importance of preaching. By way of example, Martin Luther was exceptionally critical of what he called mass priests, that is, priests who only celebrated the mass and didn't undertake the preaching duty that he thought was absolutely essential. This also, to sort of summarize what the main thrust of the continental context was and what its challenge to the normative understanding of priesthood as a holy order is that it moved from this traditional understanding of priesthood as a holy order and presented an understanding of priesthood as a form of office holder, someone who, in essence, with the universal priesthood, anyone could be a priest, but there were certain people who did undertake this function because it was practically important for people to hold said office and to perform said functions. It, however, wasn't something that is limited only to the continent. So as Malcolm Yarnell wrote in his study of the royal priesthood and the English Reformation, it is widely acknowledged that the sacrament of orders was a hot issue in the mid-1530s, but the material has apparently never been drawn together in an effort to summarize that debate. He wrote that and then, of course, drew together the evidence in order to summarize that debate. And he presented three major strands in English thinking. The first he associated with Stephen Gardiner, who is the gentleman in the middle. And Stephen Gardiner he associated with a conservative and a hierarchical understanding of priesthood and the structure of priesthood. This is in relation to the fact that the royal supremacy had been introduced, and Gardiner presented the king on top of the church and on top of the ecclesial structure, accepting the notion of the royal supremacy in ecclesiastical affairs. Below the king, and this is where we get the hierarchical aspect, was the episcopacy, then the general clergy and ecclesiastical office holders, and below that was the laity. The next sort of strand was associated with Edward Fox, and I don't have a picture of Edward Fox, mainly because I've discovered in preparing this PowerPoint that there is a somewhat famous actor called Edward Fox and could only find pictures of him, and I'm afraid I might have been too young to have actually known that that was the case. But Edward Fox adopts this arguably more Lutheran understanding, where he sees there a form of cooperation between the laity and the clergy. The difference, however, is that this still retains some form of what we might want to call a conservative or hierarchical element, in that there's a cooperation between the clergy and the laity, but ultimately they are all still under the king as supreme in both ecclesial and secular affairs. The other, more radical strand is associated with William Tyndale, who takes on the more challenging notion of a priesthood as someone who holds an office. What he did that provides a lot of this challenge is in his translation, taking the word presbytos, and instead of translating it as would be traditionally done to priest, he translated it to elder. So as well as these three strands of English thought in relation to the nature and understanding of holy orders and priesthood, I think it's also important to really stress the fact that Henry VIII and the introduction of the royal supremacy has a tremendous jurisdictional and structural impact on ordained ministry. As seen with both Gardiner and Fox, they're having to adapt the understanding of the ecclesial structure and how priests and bishops fit in order to conform to the notion of Henry having, to accept the polemic, Henry having regained his right as king to be in charge of the religion of his country. So to get in now to a little bit more of the content of the canons, I thought it would be best to start with some of the highlights and the conclusions that I had come out with. So this is what the shape of ordained ministry and what the sort of theological positions one can start to infer from the canons themselves. So principally, it's the introduction of the royal supremacy in ecclesiastical affairs. That is fundamentally the purpose of the Henrician canons. It was the aim to try and make the canons conform with the reforms that had already been achieved by Henry VIII by 1535. And part of what it also does here is it maintains a hierarchical ecclesiastical structure. The canons, I would argue, firmly stick to a notion of holy orders rather than adopting this continental challenge of an office holder. Likewise, there's a form of sacramental monopoly that is associated with this. There is also some degree of cooperation, but cooperation might be a little bit too strong of a word. So there's some form of relationship going on between the clergy and the laity. And there's also a stressed importance of preaching, but very importantly to say, not as much of a stress and an emphasis as you'll find in Martin Luther, John Calvin, or William Tyndale. The other point, and this is one of the reasons why I think studying unpromulgated legislation can still be exceptionally interesting and can bring fresh insight, is that it can speak into some of the typical historiographical questions relating to the English Reformation. So because this is in the sort of embryonic early stages of the English Reformation, it can help to bring a fresh insight in parts to historiographical debates relating to the origins and the causes of the English Reformation. And one of the things that I'm going to do here and have done in my study is to actually accept Christopher Hay's argument that there isn't a substantial driving force of anti-clericalism. And this, I'd argue that the Henrician canons can support Christopher Hay, and I will get to that when we're looking at some of the canons relating to discipline and morality. So to start with sort of a broadly thematically ordered canons in relation to hierarchy and jurisdiction, and I should state all of these categories I have done thematically. I will talk a little bit about the structure of the canons themselves. To be slightly rude about the Henrician canons, they are in a little way slightly incoherent and don't always feel as if there is a particular order and that they are following a set out order. It sometimes feels a little bit that they incidentally are in the order that they are in. Part of that can be seen, for example, with marriage and divorce coming in one section, then there being a whole section on tithes and financial matters relating to property and buildings and pensions of clergy, and then going back to a little bit more on divorce. But so to talk about this hierarchy and jurisdiction, this is relating to the main purpose of the canons, as I've said, and that is the introduction of the royal supremacy. And where we get this most explicitly and most clearly is in the preface. So seeing that you, most excellent citizens of mine and most dear to me, now audibly and with one common accord acknowledge me to be the one and only prince of this realm, on earth the sole summit after God of this Church of England, and its supreme head, insofar as the nature of divine and human right allows, and that the power over the ecclesiastical as well as the earthly commonwealth granted to me and to my predecessors by that same divine right, which for many centuries has been seized by the wickedness, fraud, deceits, and cleverness of the sole Bishop of Rome, belongs to me and my successors. This is the preface of Henry VIII to the Henrician canons, and it makes this really clear, really explicit introduction of the royal supremacy. This arguably is one of the most radical and non-conservative, as a way, innovations of the Henrician canons. This is the major change that it's introducing, and that is to try and bring the existing set of canon law to entirely replace it so that English canon law it conforms to the notion of the royal supremacy. We also find some jurisdictional matters. So, for example, we grant full power to archbishops, bishops, and other judges deputed to handle heretical causes, to have the acts of the registrars and the proceedings of any other judge against heretics to be shown him on pain of ecclesiastical censure, and as well as to mitigate or modify the punishments of those imprisoned or cloistered on account of heresy, as they may see fit. This is, as I say, bringing together the ecclesiastical structure into conformity with the new reforms made in the beginning and early stages of the English Reformation. This is principally to introduce jurisdiction and hierarchy relating to the royal supremacy. To look at some of the canons relating to ordination, so appointments, elections, ordinations, and installations all being brought in as one. This is where we see most clearly the sort of fight back against the challenge of priesthood and ordained ministry being a form of office holder. And this is where we see a reiteration, and this is a reiteration by simply continuing to accept the existing norms in canon law and representing them. This is where we see the notion that priesthood is a holy order rather than being an office holder. And this canon is, I think, arguably, in a lot of ways, there's a bit of a sort of apophatic reasoning that goes on in looking at the canons and looking at what's prohibited, what might mean that you can't be a priest, what might make you suspended, what you might get excommunicated for. This is arguably, when looking to try and find a theology of ordained ministry in the canons, one of the few positive aspects we have. So we order the principle to be maintained that everyone should enter ecclesiastical order by stages. The first one should be a parish clerk, then a reader, then an exorcist, then to be ordained an acolyte, then a subdeacon, then a deacon, and afterwards a presbyter, which here would be translated as priest rather than elder. Finally, if he is worthy, he may be consecrated as a bishop. And this is one of the points where we can see this form of successive entering into orders. And again, we get explicitly ecclesiastical orders rather than relating to an office. There's also a form of sacramental monopoly which is going on. So if anyone administers any sacrament of the church, apart from baptism in case of necessity, when he is not lawfully ordained to do so, he shall be expelled from the church for his termity and shall never afterwards be ordained. There's also quite an interesting point here in terms of that there is a textual change here made. So we see a little bit more of the Henrician canons departing from some of the existing corpus of medieval and early canon law. So this canon it seems to come from the decretal of Hormidius in the 5th or 6th century. However, the textual change is the insertion of the phrase apart from baptism in the case of necessity. So it's maintaining this sacramental monopoly, but is also accepting the developed understanding of baptism as a fundamental necessity to salvation, and therefore something that one is able to administer as a layperson in extreme circumstances. And we see some of that extreme circumstances in Martin Luther's writing. So Luther talks about the fact that if someone were to be, if a group of people were to be in a wood, isolated and in need of baptism, then one of them could undertake that. Luther then takes it even further and says that if they wanted to receive Holy Communion, if they nominated one of themselves to do that, that person could act as a priest, and when they returned from the wilderness, would be considered just as much as a priest as someone who had been episcopally ordained. This canon that I won't read out because that would take awfully long, is in essence, I think this is the entire discernment process and the criteria or qualities as they're now called for selection for ordination. And to give a little bit of a sort of summary, it requires people to be learned in the law and rules of the church, to be well brought up, and rather interestingly, to be able to explain the Catholic faith in understandable terms. It also is outlining being ordained on the basis of favoritism or financial reward. So the key points that are coming forward of that there's an understanding that retains the notion of priesthood being a holy order. There's also this monopoly of the sacraments, and the canons relate to some form of territoriality in relation to ordination. And so there's strict punishment about if one is ordained knowingly or unknowingly by the bishop of someone else, and how that's resolved. There's also some presentation and of the importance and the essentiality of priests in communities, partly seen through the fact that there is a need to find good quality and good, well-qualified candidates for the priesthood. And as mentioned, there is also in the relation to orders this positive aspect of them being successive and adding on. Next comes the office of preaching, and although it is somewhat important, as I say, it's not presented and emphasized to the same level as Luther, Calvin, and Tyndale. In this canon we have, no one shall presume to exercise the office of preaching publicly or privately, unless a license which he has previously obtained, either from the metropolitan within his province or from the bishop within his diocese, has been shown to the curate of the parish where he intends to preach. However, we grant complete freedom for rectors, vicars, and others to whom the cure of soul belongs to preach in the churches and places committed to them. This is interestingly one of those situations where we're not looking to existing the Code of Canon Law, so what we might call the Roman Catholic Code of Canon Law. The precedent for here is looking to the Council of Oxford and the statute, so 2 Henry VI, chapter 15, relating to mints, passed in 1423. We also have what's quite a well-established practice in the medieval church, and that is to have lists of approved or not approved books in relation to teaching. there's not awfully much other than in this section on preaching. However, we do find one requirement to preach or to teach against magic. And one can see that this is against magic in the basis that that said magic and magical arts and incantations are ineffectual and can't actually provide what the person is looking for. It's interesting to note that in Calvin's Institutes, one also finds this strong anti-magical arts and incantations expression. And this, the canons are drawing upon Augustine and the Third Council of Tours. That the interesting point that it depends how far one wishes to go in trying to argue how significant it might be, and this is where the sort of interpretive challenge comes of whether or not something is an accident or incidental, or if something is deliberate. And that's to say that the Henrician canons depart from what one might call the normative structure of codes of canons. So this structure can be seen in the Compilatio Prime of 1119, and generally most codes of canons would follow this structure, where they first look at judges and ecclesiastical officers, they then look at courts, it then looks at clergy, moves on to marriage and divorce, and then ends with church discipline. The Henrician canons most certainly doesn't follow this at all, and this arguably they also present in some form of, as I've said, incoherent way. Interestingly, however, preaching ends up as a the second title. So straight after the first title of the doctrine of the church, we have preaching. This then gets into the point, as I say, of this interpretive difficulty of, is this just an accident, or has it been put there deliberately in order to present some form of strong emphasis of preaching in the church? Unfortunately, I think for the moment that's probably something that ends up a little bit of if I say a mystery that one might not truly know for certain. However, it does present some form of importance of preaching. It's important, as I say, however, that this doesn't go as far as Luther and Calvin in presenting the essential element of preaching as fundamental to the office of priest. A large proportion of the canons relate to what I've broadly called discipline and morality. And this presents some form of understanding of priesthood that has a dignity that needs to be sort of reputationally upheld, and in some ways, one might argue, needs to be protected. It presents a church in the same way that is hierarchical and structured with order and discipline. However, I think the difficulty might become is when one looks at canons relating to discipline and morality and clerical discipline, and to assume that it is in some way anti-clerical. And I will move on to explain why I don't believe canons relating to discipline can be used to say that there is some form of anti-clericalism motivating the beginnings of the English Reformation. So first we have very much this against simony, against and many matters relating to what I might broadly want to call a category of financial corruption. So orders shall be conferred by bishops free of charge. If a bishop grants orders for money or in return for any reward, he has automatically been suspended from the exercise of his office until he has shown himself worthy to obtain the benefit of absolution from the archbishop. And we will that anyone ordained by someone so suspended shall himself be suspended from the exercise of his ordination for a 3-year period. We also have here, above all else, every effort must be made to ensure that in elections, no giving of bribes should intervene in any way whatsoever, or should any person be elected who wishes to pander to the unlawful desires of the electors. I do find the phrase every effort rather interesting here. Rather than it being explicit that this shouldn't happen, one should take every effort to make sure that it doesn't. What I've done here on this slide is compile an illustrative list of the range of reasons why one might be suspended, deposed, or excommunicated. So as we've seen, conferring orders for a fee, being ordained for a fee, a monastery receiving money for entrance to an order, confessing to being a notorious fornicator, violating one's oaths, disobeying your ordinary, being a gamer, a playboy, a gambler, or a drunkard without repentance, glorying in your wrongdoing, breaking the seal of confession, performing ministerial duties while suspended, being ordained under the age of 24, receiving multiple orders in a single day, ordaining to multiple orders in a single day for the bishop, ordaining a parishioner of another bishop, as I've mentioned, that there's some form of territoriality going on, becoming disabled, not residing in a benefice, or holding benefices in plurality. And so to pick out two examples here, and I think these two examples, I'm trying to show that there's some form of importance on protecting the dignity through the fact that they both relate to what one might want to call sort of reputational and public sins. So with the first one, if a clergyman has been a notorious fornicator to the point where he has confessed it in court, been convicted and lawfully condemned, he shall be suspended from the celebration of divine service and a matter of course until he has done the penance imposed on him. And that comes from a decretal of Gregory IX. And then secondly, we have, since it is a serious crime for Christians to glory in their wrongdoing, and it happens from time to time that some of them are not ashamed to confess in public that they have known women carnally. And this comes from the decretal of Innocent III. The point about anti-clericalism, however, that I want to make is that it'd be very easy to look at this set of canons and to say it's trying to order priests and to recognize some of the ways. So being ordained too young, not being educated, engaging in all forms of vices and sins, and genuinely being a disreputable and not well respected order of people might indicate some element of backlash against this. And this is where one might see, in essence, the canons trying to fight against that. The point quite simply that I'd want to make of why that shouldn't be made is that these canons all come from the existing corpus of canon law. These are things that were already canons that are now being broken, or had been being broken for quite a while. So again, I don't think the Henrician canons demonstrate an element of anti-clericalism because of their order relating to the suspension and deposition of those holding benefices. Rather, it illustrates the fact that this is a highly conservative set of canons that is drawing on the existing set of canon law. And the final canon that I'll look at is I've put under this category of a right to a priest, which I just find is quite an interesting one in relation to what we might want to call the essentiality and a perception of the importance of a priest. And so this is when enough lepers are gathered together in a community that they can form their own church with a cemetery and enjoy their own priest. They shall be permitted to have these things without any objection, as long as they are in no way detrimental to parish churches in matters of parish law, and so on. And this comes from the Third Lateran Council and a papal bull of Nicholas IV. The Henrician canons seem to accept a really strong importance of priesthood. It's something which is essential. The administration and distribution of the sacraments is something that is seen as a fundamental necessity. And this is where the set apart holy order becomes even more important, as it were. So to look at the sort of principal manifestation of the Henrician canons conservatism, this is the broad set of sources that the committee led by Richard Gwent drew upon. So the Corpus Juris Canonici, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and then some forms of English legislation. I've then broken it down to look at what's specifically relating to ordained ministry. So of the 70 or so canons, only 17 of them are having what one might want to claim as solely English sources. So rather than looking to the existing councils and decretals. So fundamentally, this is a representation and a wholesale copy of the existing code of canon law. The reason why I think when one contextualizes this as it becomes important is because in the 1530s, there is this challenge to the normative understanding of priesthood as a holy orders. And so there is some significance, even if not directly speaking to the arguments of say, William Tyndale or Calvin and Luther. It's adding a conservative voice that is ultimately doomed to fail by being dismissed by Cromwell. And this has a really interesting impact in terms of the historiography, because it suggests to an element that the Henrician Reformation it is of a conservative character at the beginning, that it's piecemeal, and one sees the conservative of the canons, both in their content and as a form of legislation, ultimately leading to their dismissal by Thomas Cromwell. So just to summarise some of the shape of ordained ministry, as it were, the Henrician canons are fundamentally conservative and they are hierarchical, and they protect this normative understanding of holy orders rather than an office holder. This order is dignified and should be protected from reputational damage, and there is some form of essentiality in relation to society as a whole. Likewise, there is a sacramental monopoly and an importance of preaching. So despite this not being entirely comprehensive of all of the canons and having a lot of raw information, as it were, I hope this has given you a little bit of a flavour and an insight into the Henrician canons and the nature of ordained ministry in the 1530s. And the main argument that I've been putting forward is that there is some value in studying these, because it gives a little bit more, through a contextualization and an input into a very specific element of their theology, it gives a little bit more of a voice and a bit more of a life to what is generally being seen as their incidental conservatism. And instead it becomes a very deliberate and quite meaningful conservatism that, as we say, ultimately ends up failing as the canons are dismissed and never promulgated.
Edward, thank you so much. What an absolutely fascinating lecture. Really, really interesting. Thank you. Thank you indeed. You kindly said you'd have a little bit of time for a few questions or comments. Perhaps, and I hope others will bring things forward, perhaps if I kick off. I mean, I think it's such an amazing presentation. I think bringing out the detail of those canons, but also of a few canons, but also setting it in that wide context. So what I want to ask is, am I right in thinking that had these canons been brought in to force, promulgated, they were intended to completely replace everything that had been the historical received canon law? Is that right?
Yes, yes. You've sort of, that question has made me want to use the sort of illustration that I ought not to use, but to compare it a little bit with Brexit, this is in essence the taking all of the existing laws and saying, let's pass one big bit of legislation that brings some form of similarity. So it is supposed to be fundamentally comprehensive and replace the existing corpus of medieval canon law. Yes.
Great. So my follow-up question to that is that given that form, that ones where the intention was these canons would completely start again from ground zero, yet their content, as you've been showing us, are conservative, and you think the form suggests this is something radical, starting again from scratch, but then the content poured into that tabula rasa, put on that tabula rasa, is something conservative, and it seems a little odd, doesn't it, to start again, go back, from nothing, and to put the same material back. And of course, what really happened in actual fact is that there never was this reset, and that the medieval canons continued in force, except as time went on, bit by bit, piecemeal, bits were changed or added. So ironically, from what you've been saying, that Thomas Cromwell's action in stopping this direction actually led to something more conservative, in a sense, happening, in that there was this ongoing continuity and not this sort of radical break in canon law. So does any reflections on that?
I think it's slightly where I think there is value in studying them as and generally unpromulgated legislation. They also, I think, in terms of this being something that in itself, having an entire sort of new English set of canon law, is something that's quite radical, but it is then conservative, I think one could claim is quite illustrative of the early stages of the English Reformation, something that is quite radical, but still fundamentally conservative.
Interesting, really fascinating. Well, do we have any other points or questions? If anybody wants to raise a digital hand or put a comment in the... James, far away.
Hello. I wondered if in thinking about where the conservatism of the canon comes from, you said all 4 members of the drafting committee were members of Doctors' Commons. And it strikes me that that's probably quite significant in terms of their legal formation. Of course, they would have had a canonical and civilian legal background. So is part of the conservatism simply a case of we need to draft something and therefore we turn to what we know?
Yes, I think to an extent that I've slightly, so in the dissertation have made some form of argument about the composition and the drafting committee. How I fit that in with the argument is to say nearly exactly that there is an inherent conservatism coming from the fact that one asks the sort of who one typically would want to go to. So it's looking to the establishment, it's looking to the Dean of the Arches to do this. So I think that is an argument that can be made about the conservatism of them in terms of going to that sort of traditional expected route of who might do it.
Great, thank you. It's a great question and thought. Any other questions or points anyone wants to make? Well, I had another thought while other people are thinking of their question. Are there any other things in these canons? Can you see, on the one hand, on the radical end of the spectrum, is there any hint of the forthcoming dissolution of the monasteries in any way? And also, you mentioned in passing the seal of confession. So clearly there was assumption that that despite that tension between the royal courts and the royal authority that the seal has, that was clearly something that was going to be going to continue. So any thoughts on either of those points?
Yeah, I expect that my only answer is to say that is rather interesting. I can't say that I had noticed anything, but that's something I will look up. But that is a very interesting thought of what might be going on there. Yes.
Sure, thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Emma, I hadn't seen your hand there.
That's okay. I may have totally misunderstood it, so apologies if I did. I was interested in looking at the lists of things in which you could be expelled by, and one of them was to be if you became disabled.
Mm-hmm.
Is that as we understand the term disabled, or is there another meaning to it, or do you know anything more about that?
I suppose that's me putting it in quite a sort of shorthand way. When reading through the canons, I had the slight problem of trying not to go too far onto really interesting sort of tangents. And one of the interesting points that I'd found that there is a different wording in the Latin, but it's in essence what one would translate as becoming handicapped versus becoming invalid. If you became invalid, you would be the idea would be that you would be supported by your parish and you'd be provided an assistant to help you in your duties. But if you became handicapped, then you would be deposed. I can't work out exactly what the sort of form of technical difference between becoming handicapped and invalid would be. But I do think that was one of those things that I had seen and thought, gosh, that there might be something quite exciting and interesting there, but I don't have the answer to it, no.
Russell, you're on mute still.
Thank you. I didn't realize I was on mute. Yes, Jeremy, do unmute yourself and ask a question.
Would these have been before or after the execution of Anne Boleyn?
That unfortunately requires me to remember when Anne Boleyn was executed, but I can't do it.
Is it 1533,
1533, then it would be, so these would be
1533, I think.
Yes, so these would be then after with 1535.
It wouldn't be a reaction to it.
I try and see in what way would it, I can't understand how it would be a reaction directly to that.
But it's just that she was a member of a reforming group, but maintained her private book of prayers is quite profound.
Yeah,
it was trying to see the way out from where Anne Boleyn's death or execution left the church.
Yeah, yes, I see your point. Yes, I mean that again is another interesting point that I don't think I can firmly provide a strong opinion on. But yes, I think it then becomes in essence the sort of knowing the motivations of the four committee members, and that's something that I've found relatively interesting in terms of how much one can find on the four of them. It's to say John Hughes rather annoyingly isn't even in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So they are figures, again, one of these little things that would be quite fun to go down is to try and look firmly into the background of the committee members. So Richard Gwent is the one that is known most by, who's quite associated with some of Henry's legal cases and in relation to annulment as well.
Somebody's texted saying that the execution was in 1536.
Okay, then we've been speculating on, yes. Thank you very much for that, Emma.
Right, we've got a question from Alan.
Hi, there was a reference to approved books for preaching and teaching. Was there actually a list of such books attached or to be found anywhere?
Not attached to the manuscript of the Henrician Canons. I'm assuming there must be some form of at least, even if not entirely up to date, one can find a sort of illustrative list of what sort of things were approved and weren't. That I don't have to hand at the moment, I'm afraid. But yes, but not contained in the manuscript with the Henrician Canons itself.
It simply says there should be such a
yes, yes, and it's relatively known that was a practice that was relatively common in the medieval church. I think that's again something actually to slightly put into for the canons to argue about their own sort of constrained aspect of to put it in. So to actually put a list in that themselves would be quite difficult to then be amended to, because it would have to go through the convocations that arguably the government, although had made subordinate, had a little bit less control over, as it were. And so yes, so it's something a little bit more separate that can be amended and added to and changed a little bit more frequently.
And as to the education of the clergy, again, just the requirement that they be educated in certain ways.
It's nicely vague, I think. And being someone who's training to be a priest, to turn up the day before and be examined seems well, it puts all in that one moment, but makes it seem a lot more simple than it is these days. But I won't idolize the past, because there's lots of problems with it as well. But
thank you.
Right, thanks for those questions, Alan. We've got a question from Richard.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry if by the end of the lecture I've forgotten what you said at the beginning of the lecture. Obviously, you focus very much on what the canons say about ordained ministry. I just wondered to what extent, I mean, how complete are these canons? I mean, they stop mid-sentence, but how complete are they? Can you see there's a lot left to do? Was there not left to do? And I suppose is that I suppose they were discovered in 1970. They were rediscovered in the 1970s. Is there now a printed secondary edition? or is it just still only one prime? Is it only? Do we all have to go to the British Library now? Because I'm sitting here feeling a bit ignorant that I didn't really know that they existed.
No. So Gerald Bray produced a very nice translation and edition with very, very good footnotes, I will say, in 2000. So it took 20 or so years, but it's very good. That's with the Church of England Record Society.
Oh, not in the big volume, in a separate volume.
In Tudor Church Reform.
Thank you.
That's right.
But how sorry, my first question. You know, how complete are they? What's the sense of the scale?
I'm not entirely sure in terms of to say how complete they are. It's sort of guessing if there are things, and this would be something that I think would be me taking a lot more time than I have, is to look at, because the other way of looking at what was included is also to look to the Code of Canon Law and try and notice what they haven't included. So it's difficult to know if there is any, from my perspective, if there's any intent to deliberately miss out parts of the canons, the existing Code of Canons. All I can say with quite confidence, with a relatively strong degree of confidence in the fact that the manuscript that we have isn't finished, does mean that the copy we have definitely isn't complete. It's interesting to know. I think there's generally, I to criticize myself, sometimes work with this assumption that they might be complete if that sentence were finished. There's of course the aspect that that manuscript might not just be missing the end of a sentence, it might be missing a lot more. That is, I would say, one of the mysteries that I think studying early modern history is one of those mysteries that I find quite exciting, even though if I can't fully provide an answer to exactly how complete they might be.
Thank you.
Well, I think thanks for that question. I think we're coming to the end of the time. I know Edward has available. We could maybe able to squeeze in one final quick question if anyone has a burning point. Otherwise, I will draw things to a close. I just wanted to say, first of all, remind everyone that we have our day conference, this at the Ecclesiastical Law Society. That's this Saturday in London. Details are on the website, and you've got till 5 o'clock tomorrow to book if you would like to come along. And there are more online lectures coming up. The next one online is September or something like that, another historical one. But again, they're all on the website, so please do sign up, and more are being added all the time. Thank you to everyone who attended this evening. Thanks to Stephen Hogg, who assisted with the tech. And especially Edward, thank you to you. You've introduced something that to most of us is very new, given us a huge amount of insight and things to think about, as ever, showing how the study of ecclesiastical law opens up so many windows: theological, constitutional, historical. It's been really fascinating. Thank you so much. Good night.